Today we're continuing our studies on the life of David, and we're going to be looking at the passage which is contained in 1 Samuel chapter 21. 1 Samuel 21. Remember the last occasion we looked at, we were looking through chapter 19 and the narrative in that chapter. Chapter 20 deals very much with David and Jonathan, and now 21 we see David is protected. David protected. It's a chapter of very strange events. Saul is still intent on killing David. David is on the run from Saul. And remember that proclamation that we saw at the beginning of chapter 19 last time, that Saul made to those in the palace, the proclamation that anybody in the palace that had opportunity was to seek to kill David. And the effect this must have had on the palace servants who knew and respected David, and also on Jonathan himself. This is a chapter of two incidents. We have the friendly priest and the foreign king. Saul is still pursuing David. He's chasing him to an obscure place called Nob. It's a mile, it's just north of Jerusalem. And here there were obviously a company of priests. And the chief priest here is this man called Ahimelech, not to be confused with Abimelech, but he is Ahimelech, the priest at Nob, verses 1 to 2. And David meets Ahimelech. Now, can you imagine at this time, David's been on the run. He's a fugitive, basically. He must have been tired. He must have looked disheveled and weary. Not a very pleasant sight to look at as the king or the prospective king. So Ahimelech, when David comes to him, he's concerned by David's presence. He trembles, we see. He's afraid. He's concerned why David has come to him. And he asks him, firstly, why are you alone? Is no one with you? It would seem that somebody of David's position, David's rank, hardly ever travelled alone. Yet here is David appearing at Nob alone. There's no sign of anybody with him. Now, it's not very clear as to whether the news of Saul pursuing David has reached Nob, of Saul's rages and the jealousy. Some commentators think so, others think not. Given the answer that David gives Ahimelech, it's not very clear. David tells Ahimelech that he is on a secret mission. Just look in verse 2. So David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has sent me on some business, and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I sent you, or what I commanded you. And I had directed my young men to such and such a place.'" This is what Ahimelech is told by David. Basically, he's been sent by Saul. He's on a secret mission that he's not to tell anybody about, and the men that are with him are elsewhere. Ahimelech presumably accepts the word of David, but he's afraid of David. So David's reply here is clearly a lie. He's lying to protect himself. And David puts a lie now into the mouth of Saul, because he's saying that the king has ordered that he goes on this business, and the king has said that nobody else is to know about this business. And then he also refers to his young men. And David comes to Ahimelech alone. Next time in chapter 22, we will see how David lives to regret this lie in verse 2. Trapp, the commentator, said, "Some go about to excuse David's lying here, but that cannot be. The consequences of it were very sad, and afterwards made his soul melt for heaviness. So firstly, he comes to the priest Elimelech and he asks, he's asked by the priest if he's alone. Secondly, David asks Ahimelech if he has any food. Verse 3, now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found. David obviously has been on the run. We don't know for how long, but David's been on the run. He's been living rough, and he is desperately in need of food. So as he comes to Ahimelech at Nob, the first thing he really asks for is food, quite naturally. But Ahimelech has a problem, that there is no food here. It would suggest that there were very few priests at Nob. And the bread that Ahimelech has, the only bread, is the showbread from the tabernacle. Now, that was normally only eaten by the priests. There was in the tabernacle here, which obviously based at Nob at this time, the table that held the 12 loaves, which showed God's presence with the people and the 12 tribes. And the importance and the meaning of this bread, it says it is showbread. It's the bread of faces. And it's to be eaten in God's presence. It's to be eaten there in the tabernacle. Meir says showbread is the bread of presence, or the presence bread. So to eat the showbread was to eat in God's house as a guest of the Lord. And the showbread always was fresh, and it would be replaced once a week with fresh bread. So all that Ahimelech has is the old bread, as it were, the stale bread, the bread that's been there for a week, which has been replaced with new bread. Now, because it was part of the tabernacle, it was considered as holy, and the showbread wasn't to be treated casually. It was to be eaten by the priests. Leviticus 24, verse 9. It shall be for Aaron and his sons. They shall eat it in a holy place. It wasn't to be eaten anywhere. Although it says only the priests could eat it, and it was regarded as holy. It doesn't say only priests. So Ahimelech asked David a question before he gives him this bread. He's talking about the young men, and he is thinking that he's going to give this bread to these supposed young men. Verse 4, you can have it if the young men have at least kept themselves from women. Remember, this bread is holy. It's part of the showbread. It's part of the tabernacle. It's to be treated as holy. Therefore, anybody that eats it is to be clean, not being defiled in any way. So David assures him, yes, it is true that the men have not been traveling with women, so David is given the bread. Ahimelech gives him the bread because he sees that he is hungry. Verse 7. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. Now this verse almost seems out of context here, but as we go into chapter 22, we will see the significance of this verse 7 here and Doeg. And this verse comes between the two incidents that are recorded at Nob. David coming to Ahimelech and asking him for the bread, being given the bread. And then in verse 8, David changes tact. And here he says in verse 8 to Ahimelech, I want a weapon. David's come with nothing. And it's quite natural that David could see the need for a weapon. So he asks Ahimelech if there is a weapon there, if there's a sword. Now, again, it seems strange that there should be a weapon where the tabernacle is. But there is a weapon there. And that weapon is something that David is familiar with already, because Ahimelech tells him that Goliath's sword, which he used when he killed Goliath, is there at Nob. Why David knew that before, or what had happened to the sword, is not very clear. But there is this sword of Goliath's, which is behind the ephod in the tabernacle. So David says in verse 9, there is none like it. Give it to me. He wants Goliath's sword. So then he leaves Nob. He leaves probably Abimelech, rather mystified by the events, and he goes off into the countryside again. And then he arrives, verse 10, David arose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achash, king of Gath. A few miles away, he's moved on, and he now arrives in Philistine territory with Goliath's sword. Now, so far in this chapter, we have not seen any mention of David's faith in God or his trust in God. What does David have in his hand? A Philistine sword. Redpath says, David lost confidence in God and in fulfillment of God's purposes for his life, which had been revealed to him. He went to God's house, to the tabernacle at Nob, for comfort, help, and guidance. But he was detected as being wrong in his soul. Instead of acknowledging the truth to the only one who could help him, and confessing that he'd been telling a lie, he runs again for his life. And he arrives in Gath with Goliath's sword, about 10 miles away from Nob. And he comes into Gath, and the servants of King Achash recognize who he is. Verse 11, the servants of Achash said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? Here is David now with Goliath's sword among the Philistines. Whether he came to Gath thinking that Achash would give him refuge, he will be able to hide there from Saul, we don't know. Was he trying to find a refuge among the enemies of Israel? But perhaps he thought it's some long time ago that he met with Goliath. They wouldn't recognize him. He was then a much younger man. But as we've seen, those who were there, the servants of the king, firstly recognize him. They recognize David. And then his reputation goes before them. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Who is this referring to? This is referring to the number of Philistines that have been killed by Saul and by David. And here they have heard of his reputation. They've known the song that had been sung as he killed Goliath. Here he is in Gath, in the midst of the Philistines. So he then comes to Achash, and he changes his behavior. He realizes that this ruse, this subterfuge, is not going to work. They know who he is. So he changes tact. And now David is the one who is afraid. Verse 12. David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achash, the king of Gath. David knew he'd been discovered, and he knew, as he was now in the Philistine country, that the Philistines wouldn't let him go, for he was the man who had killed their Philistine giant. So to escape, in verse 13, he changes his tact and he pretends to be mad. He starts scratching on the door of the gate. He lets saliva fall down his beard as if he's foaming at the mouth. And saliva on the beard was especially convincing in that culture because they knew only a man out of his right mind would allow that to happen. So here, as far as the king is concerned, is a man who is insane. Why have you brought him to me? He doesn't recognize him as David. And David's plan works. For Achash decides he's going to let him go. In the NIV, it says, "Am I so short of madmen that you brought this fellow to me?" So David escapes once again. He escapes from Gath. So this chapter is a chapter of strange events. It doesn't make sense. The man who killed Goliath now has Goliath's sword, and he's going into Goliath's own town. He's asked for bread from the sacred place, the tabernacle, to go amongst the heathen, amongst the Philistines. So it doesn't make sense for David, a man after God's own heart, to go to the Philistines. F.B. Mayer, in his book David Shepherd, Psalmist King, says, "This certainly was one of the least dignified episodes in David's varied life, very unworthy of God's anointed. The shame was that there would have been no need for it if he had not departed through unbelief in the living God." So this is a passage of fear. Fear in David. There is no apparent sign of any faith, as we've seen in the past in the life of David. And faith, as it said, is a great antidote to fear. Now, there are two psalms that have been penned, particularly concerning this time. And the first is in Psalm 56. And Psalm 56 sheds a bit more light on this passage to help us understand more about it. The title given over Psalm 56 is, it's a psalm of David he wrote when the Philistines captured him in Gath. Although the reading that we have in front of us, Samuel 21, doesn't tell us, but it's clear that the Philistines actually captured David. He wasn't taken in voluntarily. They captured him and took him to the king. So whether this psalm was written when he was seized or after he was free is not clear. So David thought that remaining anonymous among the Philistines, he could do this, he could hide, but he was wrong. And David changes in the psalm from fear to praising. Psalm 56 shows us the slope that he's on as he's left Jonathan and he continues into Gath. And then it stops. In this Psalm 56, David now comes onto that higher plane. The difference between David and Saul. Saul kept on falling and falling, but David comes back to the Lord. So this change is seen in Psalm 56, that the Lord would guide David. David repents. David asks for mercy. He sees what fear has done to him. He's at his lowest point. But then in verse 13, he acknowledges God's goodness to him. And then Psalm 34. Psalm 34 is a psalm of joy when he has escaped from Gath. The title over the psalm reads, "A Psalm of David when he pretended madness before Abimelech." Abimelech is another name for the king of Achash, just to confuse us with Ahimelech, when he pretended madness before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed. But this psalm here, Psalm 34, David is amazed that God has shown him gratitude throughout these incidents, Nob and in Gath. David is joyful. David is praising God because he has rescued him. As far as David was concerned, the way David had gone about it was a complete shambles. But God's goodness is shown in rescuing, in protecting David. And God protected and rescued David. Although he'd lied, he'd sinned, he'd gone away from God. And the psalm reflects the events of happening there and brings out the fact of God's faithfulness. This chapter in 1 Samuel 21, we don't see the best of David, but God has not deserted him. Just read through Psalm 34, particularly verse 4, verse 7 and 8.